So, just a quick question. There's not too many people here, but does anyone in the room still use a phone that looks something like that? One person, huh?
Who's going to admit it?
I know. It's a trick question.
If we did, we wouldn't admit it.
All right. So after the event, I will happily host a seminar, and we will talk about, among other things, how to buy a new phone. But I did see one hand, so make sure you pay attention to the next few minutes. So very sort of at a very high level, what does a consumer view a mobile device to be today, right? I mean, up until 2005, it was very much a communications medium. And now it is sort of, I guess, a Swiss Army knife of functionality. Basically, there's a lot of end markets that have sort of been subsumed into the mobile device, and at a very surface level, that's sort of interesting, and it probably has driven some level of growth in smartphones, but I don't necessarily think that's why mobile is compelling today. So I think that what is very compelling about this environment today is the application environment that has only been about 2 years old. And what is happening from our perspective is that people are using facilities that are dedicated to a mobile device, and they're creating very interesting services. And so I think we're seeing the early end of sort of services that are combining concepts like gaming and location in some areas of identity. But I think that we're sort of in this app environment, and that's sort of going to continue to be an interesting opportunity. The question is, what is sort of the next evolution in mobile? There's a lot of interesting candidates, one of which may be commerce, payments, additional interesting location-based services. So I think that will be a topic of a lot of discussion for the rest of the day. What we tried to do was try to simplify this. I know that the ecosystem is fairly fragmented, and there are a lot of subsegments within this. But what we tried to do was, for the purpose of this discussion, try to break it down for the purpose of trying to talk about M&A and sort of where money has gone. So on the left to right is really just sort of more marketing, measurement, analytics sort of oriented solutions, commerce and payments in a bucket, content and social. We won't talk much about hardware or the network, but obviously those are very important topics. So I wouldn't be, a banker if we didn't take a bunch of logos and put it on a page and try to bucket them. I think this is a representation of kind of the environment in, I think, a lot of the companies we run into, a lot of more well-known and press-worthy companies. I think what we find interesting is that there's going to be a lot of bleeding going on between these four buckets, but today they're still fairly distinct. So, for example, in e-commerce, there's still a lot of focus on on-deck sort of commerce and how people will be buying certain types of goods on an actual mobile device. In the last 12 months or so, you've seen some shift towards how a mobile device could actually be interesting in a physical environment, but very early still there. I think from a social standpoint, a lot of companies that most people recognize, it's still about how do we build a distribution network. There's still a lot of experimenting going on with regards to how do we actually monetize this distribution network. In terms of how this sort of ecosystem has come to be, what has happened is sort of pre-2005, a lot of focus and investment in infrastructure, which we won't really spend a lot of time on. But in 2005, there was a lot of land grab going on in marketing ad network-based businesses for mobile, and there were a lot of economies of scale, and so a lot of money and capital went into it to try to get to critical mass. On the right, I think in the social world, I think what we're seeing is people are now realizing and understanding what user value is, especially on the desktop environment, and now there's a lot of focus on how do we recreate a social environment using sort of the unique characteristics of a mobile phone. E-commerce, I think that you'll start to see more fundraising and capital raise in 2011 and 12 as people start to experiment more with how do we tap a $1 trillion sort of physical retail environment. And then content will continue to be interesting, not only in games, which has been where a lot of funding has been, but also in a variety of categories, including content and how that impacts local. So acquisitions, there haven't been a lot of sort of very big acquisitions. There's a few. I would say that the acquisition pattern is somewhat predictable, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think what it's been is very focused on companies that have raised lots of capital 5 years ago, are starting to see liquidity today. Most of the ad networks, there's a few still remaining. Social is raising, in the social bucket, a lot of companies have raised money in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. So unlikely there will be a lot of consolidation over the next year or two. There will probably be a couple of big deals done. And then e-commerce, I think the buyer universe is very different. You'll start seeing, I think, retail be more interested. And in content, gaming continues to be sort of an area of M&A. So in terms of just quick themes going sort of 05 to today, very infrastructure-led 5 years ago. I would say in 2007 and 8, there was some experimentation that went on in applications. There were a couple of scale deals in marketing. Third Screen, In Pocket, a couple of companies that were starting very early before the application ecosystem developed on mobile. And then in the last couple of years, applications have just sort of broadened out tremendously to include areas of gaming in a more significant way and location-based services. So who's sort of doing all the buying? Google is naturally acquirer in the desktop environment, and then I think they're probably one of the top 2 or 3 acquirers. Not much change here. I think a lot of it's towards experimentation. They have made some significant acquisitions, such as Android, but they'll continue to buy teams and selectively buy assets as it relates to some of the assets they have in local. eBay has been sort of interesting and seems to have a very interesting commerce strategy. And what they've done, I think, which I think a number of other companies haven't yet sort of pieced together, is a sort of a clearer strategy around what commerce means in local and how they could play a role. They have, I think, with their acquisitions, they've made a number of acquisitions, including Red Laser, which is comparison shopping in the store, Milo, which is sort of real-time inventory in physical retail, Where, which is related to local marketing and et cetera. And so I think, at a summary, what they've done, I think is what they've done is taken their online business and connected it with an offline experience in the store, and then they've created an offline to an offline experience. And so as a user, one would go into a store, comparison shop with eBay results, and then also shop not only with comparison online, but also to the store to the next of you using certain inventory information they have through their Milo acquisition. And so there's a lot of integration and interesting points. I think eBay is sort of an auction business that's trying to become a mainstream commerce business, and we'll see what happens. But they've made a lot of interesting acquisitions that were much more strategic in nature, I would say, than many. Facebook is obviously hiring teams through acquisitions, and Yahoo has recently focused on how media can be impacted through mobile. So I think the good news I guess for people who think about M&A is that it's still very early. I think across sort of 4 big buckets, we're still very early in this. I think if you look at mobile and consumers and how they engage with mobile, I mean, Foursquare is sort of, 10 million users, still very small. People are buying a lot on the mobile device, but it doesn't really, 8 billion doesn't really account for what mobile can do in an offline setting. That content has primarily been driven by gaming. I think as all big media companies find ways to monetize on mobile, I think that will be a pretty interesting opportunity. Marketing is still very early, and marketing, I think, is both online and physical and payments, which I think we'll talk about later today. But there's a number of drivers, I think. I mean, penetration is still very low. There's still this idea of what can be imagined on mobile. There are a lot of characteristics of mobile that are very unique to that form factor that we're still sort of going to find interesting applications for. And then what is a mobile device? I think there's probably a debate about is a tablet a mobile device or not, but I think there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. But I think mobile and the experience that mobile has brought to consumers some of that will translate into the mobile environment, into the tablet environment. So I think the bad news still is it's still fairly complicated. I think if we just stick with these big buckets that I talked about a few minutes ago, each bucket there is innovation and people trying to build businesses around it. And we'll go through this a little bit more. But I think that from an M&A standpoint, what causes a lot of confusion is where did these things end up? And I think the punchline is we're still very early. I think social bleeds into analytics and the content bleeds into social, and there hasn't been any sort of business models that are of scale yet in this environment. I think it's a bit competitive, right? I think if you think about online brands and you think about online networks, there's a lot of emphasis about where we play in mobile. And I think every company we speak with has some mobile strategy. So mobile somehow applies to every company in this ecosystem. And so from an M&A standpoint, what happens when and how the pieces come together a little bit challenging. Some observations that I'll make about folks we talk to and sort of where we see some innovation. I think on the gaming side, it'll continue to be interesting in terms of new content development. Social has been a part of gaming for the last number of years. I think that there's already a good marketing analytics business around that in terms of driving greater adoption and greater in-store or in-app purchasing. In the news side, I think there's a number of companies that are trying to figure out how is news going to be consumed on a mobile device, and there's a few approaches being taken. Big media companies are creating their own destinations and trying to create very rich environments. Aggregators like Flipboard and others are trying to create environments, and feed companies like Twitter and others are trying to find some footing in local. And I think all three of these buckets of news have interesting ties to social. And there's a ton of metadata that I think people are still trying to figure out how is this helpful and how can we use this for the purpose of pushing things to users during their sort of casual day. And then local. Local, I think, is interesting because there are three big categories that fit into local. It's inherently most of commerce is done in a local market. There's a lot of data that comes out of people in how they interact with commerce in a local way. And social, I think, I think the early companies have taken this view that social is going to be a very interesting way of building a network, and that network will be very important to local businesses. In commerce, I think the way we would think about it is sort of in-store payments and on deck. In-store is quite early still. I think that there are interesting coupon companies. There are companies that are trying to create new product experiences for users in the store, and then loyalty is interesting. These are also, I think this notion that once networks become developed in a social, in a mobile context, those could be very interesting in terms of incentivizing people to show up at local stores and get some incentive to do so. And I think analytics and marketing sort of falls through all of these layers as ultimately data is created. I think payments and in-store will connect at some point and create some interesting sort of closed-loop analytics. I think it's been very hard, even online, to try to tie where interest is generated and trying to close that loop in attribution. All these things are very challenging. And so at some point, I think the holy grail would be marketing to users, driving them to the store, being able to track a transaction, and using that to create additional economics. And then on deck, I think what we found is that on deck commerce has worked very well with time-sensitive information. I think eBay does a couple $2 billion of revenue on deck, and we think that will just continue, and this will probably be a market that existing e-commerce players do well in. So, I guess the big questions that I think we'll probably talk about now is if you're an M&A buyer in this environment, how do you think about it? Would you buy now, or would you wait and see? I think there's probably arguments for both. I think the second question that we'll probably discuss at some point is if you're a big media company, is this a sort of a reset, new way to actually monetize your content, or is it very much going to fall the way of online, which is a very challenging economic environment? And then what are the risks of mobile? There are risks that are unique to mobile that haven't been present in the PC environment, primarily platform risks.